Good morning, good morning, good morning. And thank you so much for joining us today for Trauma in the Workplace, a three-part series where we're talking today about creating a trauma-informed workplace. My name is Patrice Peterson, and I am the Peer Workforce Coordinator here at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, specifically in the Office of Consumer Affairs. In that office, we're charged with serving you, the workforce, and really making sure your views and opinions and needs and wants are met. So feel free, we'll have a slide at the end with emails. I have what I like to call an open door policy. So any ideas or thoughts or reflections, feel free to email me at the end or talk to me in the chat. Today, we have Kathy Cave presenting. She is the Senior Training Consultant at the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Kathy comes to us also as the founder of Inspired Vision Consulting, and with over 30 years of training she has done on trauma, culture, and inclusion. Next, we have Helen Skipper, aka Skip. She is the Executive Director of the New York City Justice Peer Initiative, which deals with justice-impacted peers and getting them acclimated and ready for the workforce. Skip also does a lot of consulting on the hiring and retention of those that are justice-impacted peers. And she's currently building a certification via the APS, Academy of Peer Services platform, for the justice impacted peers. And lastly, we have Mary Ann, who will be monitoring the chat today. So if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to drop them in the chat and you'll be attended to. Mary Ann is with us from NIAPRIS and from APS. And again, she'll be monitoring the chat. So feel free to stay engaged and fully participating. Thank you.
Patrice, thank you so much for getting us started today. Really appreciate you. So our hopes for our time together. So this is our second in the series. And last time we talked a bit about understanding trauma and trauma responses. Where we want to go today is to consider the impacts of structural and institutionalized oppression on all of us as we do this work. And so whether or not we identify as people of color or as part of other marginalized groups, whether we're part of the LGBTQ community, whether we work as peer specialists, whether we are trying to show up and do as best we can, and all the things that can undermine us as we're trying to do that work. So we will be talking about some examples of workplace environments and practices that are traumatizing, and to recognize some unique challenges faced by peers who are involved with the legal system. And then we hope to share some resources that where we will focus today is uncovering workplace trauma, so that in our third and final webinar, we will work on some clear strategies for really understanding what people are experiencing and some things that we can do to take corrective action. So I apologize for my voice today. I am getting over a cold and asthma is in the mix, so I just ask you all to bear with me. If you can't hear me, please let me know. And if you have questions or comments, please join in the chat. We would love to make this a real conversation today. Of course, we're going to start with my favorite quote from Sherry Mead. That in the thick of this work, we often forget about our own needs until they're so big we can no longer meet them in simple ways. And this really just stresses the importance of having workplace wellness strategies, not just what does each person do for their own self-care, but what do our organizations do to shore us up, to support all of us who are doing this work. Doesn't matter how we identify, we're all human beings, and that we all need effective support. We need strategies to deal with trauma that comes up in our work every day, and just to recognize that we're human. So as we think about what supports us, co-regulation is really about calming together, centering together, and grounding together. It's the things that we do to say we are in this together and we can support each other to do the work, because it is very difficult and challenging work. I wanted to start with a reading about Brave Space. Together, we will create brave space, because there is no such thing as safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars and we all have caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. So that is the Invitation to Brave Space by Mickey Scott Bay Jones. And I just encourage folks to really incorporate the heart of this reading into everything that we do. There is no perfection, and as long as we're afraid to have hard conversations, we can't heal what's harming. But if we can step towards this and step towards it in brave ways, we can get there, and we can get there together. At the heart of the conversation today is that experience shapes us. Trauma shapes how we are, how we think, and how we engage. We also know that trauma overwhelms our capacities to cope. So when we talk about having a trauma-informed workplace, it means uncovering and naming the things that are harmful. And that does take being willing to look. It means that we're open, that we may find some things that we didn't realize we were doing, harms that we've been causing, and not recognizing that. So as leaders in our workspaces, it's making sure that we have that fearlessness to look straight ahead and say, yep, this is happening. We're going to stop it from happening by naming it, by uncovering it, and taking it on. A brief reminder about some of the kinds of events that contribute to workplace trauma. So there could be tragedy, things that are beyond our control that impact all of us as we work. Could be something that happens to someone who's participating in our services. It could be something that has happened to staff or to leadership, something that just rocks us to our core in our program. But also, one or more people experiencing inequitable treatment contributes to workplace trauma. And especially when the person who's feeling targeted or who's raising the issues, when that person is ignored and others see that, when that person is blamed as the source of the problem, rather than looking at, what's structurally happening that is causing folks to be uncomfortable, not included, and unwelcome. So it's really engaging and looking at these are the things that kind of rock us to our core and make it very difficult to show up for work. Limited team engagement, lack of belonging, apologize for the typo there, disrupted relationships. When we have folks who are overwatched because of their identity. So for example, if you have peer specialists working in your program and we only watch what they're doing, all kinds of other staff are doing all kinds of things, need support and supervision, but we are so focused on the identity of this one particular person that we miss opportunities for change. We focus on deficits instead of on healing, growth, and learning. Supervision and leadership are not effective. There are leadership challenges, changes in leadership. People don't feel physically or emotionally safe. And there's persistent trauma without a trauma-informed approach. So at the National Center, when we talk about trauma and being trauma-informed, we incorporate being accessible, being culturally responsive, and being trauma-informed. So it's not just trauma over here as a separate thing, and we look at what happens to individuals. We look at what happens pervasively to everyone. I'm going to turn this over to Skip, and you just, spread some jewels and gems.
Jewels and gems. Well, you know,
Yeah.
This is basically, am I muted? No, I am not. I just wanted to make sure. This is basically what I do. Good morning, everyone. This is Skip. I am the executive director of the New York City Justice Peer Initiative. I am directly impacted. And when I speak of a place coming from my lived experience. For 25 years, I cycled through systems. I am impacted by systems. Today, I work to create pathways and places for those who are directly impacted to enter into the workforce. But we have some challenges. We have some barriers that we need to navigate. And if we are not allowed to navigate them in a trauma-informed fashion, we will not be successful. We will not be successful in the workplace. And it's important to remember when you're working with those who are directly impacted in systems, this could be the criminal justice system, this could be any form of institutionalization. You have to remember that for us, when we enter the workplace, we do not have a point of reference. So when I say a point of reference, I mean, for a lot of us, we did not watch people go to work every day. So we didn't see that. We don't have media representation as well. If we were institutionalized, trust, the time we spent looking at TV was very minimal. We didn't have access to movies. We didn't read magazines that talked about what happens when you went to work. So we don't have a point of reference. We didn't look at people going to work every day. We didn't look at people talking about what happens at work. So there are a couple of skills that we will undoubtedly be lacking. We're talking about hard skills, which can be described and pointed to certain jobs. So when I say hard skills, you're looking at skills that are for certain jobs. So like, say, for instance, if you want to be a software programmer, then you need certain skills to be a software programmer. But there are other hard skills which are actually teachable and measurable. These can be skills like reading, writing, but then there are also tech skills. If you have been incarcerated for 20 or 30 years, I'm sure you guys know tech moves at the speed of light. Now, I know I look a day over 18 and nobody crack a smile because I can see you all out there in the interwebs trying to smile. Patrice, I do see you. I see you, girl. Tech moves at the speed of light. Some of us went in when we were still using tokens. Now we're phasing out the MetroCard. Some of us are even saying, what is a MetroCard? Well, this is down in New York City. Now we're using our phones. We have smartphones now. Some of us went in when we were using flip phones and the text, you had to push a button 3 times. Some of you young folks are saying, push a button 3 times. What is that? This is precisely the point I'm trying to make. Tech moves at the speed of light. In today's job market, you have to come in knowing what email is, what Outlook is. It's not really about knowing what the tactic. Oh, did I say that right? Sorry. See what I'm saying? It's not about knowing what the gram is or what the book is doing. It's about knowing how to do email, how to craft an email, how to turn on a laptop, how to use a smartphone. And when you're institutionalized and when you're directly impacted by the criminal justice system, these are not skills that are taught. So when you come home and you're looking for a job unless you want to do what I like to call frying fries and flipping burgers. Unless you want to do something other than that, then these are skills that have to be taught. And if you don't have these skills, moving into a job market or the workplace is going to be a heavy barrier. And these are things that we need to learn. And if we don't learn them, there are challenges for us. And it's putting us in the pathway for potential harm. And then there are soft skills. What are soft skills? Soft skills can refer to any job. Things like etiquette, communication, professional and work relationships, boundaries, and they relate to any job. But if we never had a chance to develop professional relationships versus personal relationships, if we had never had a chance to interact with other people on a professional level and know when not to cross boundaries, what are boundaries? If we never had a chance to develop them or never saw them in any fashion, if we never had a point of reference for them, how can we not be harmed because we don't know them? We will definitely be harmed. This is why it's so important as we come home and as we start to move into looking for employment and moving in the workspace. It's important that employers are trauma informed. And one of the things I do is I give technical assistance to employers so that they can employ people who are directly impacted. I like to call this setting the table. So I like to help employers set the table. So it's not just about developing appropriate job descriptions to hire those who are directly impacted in a peer support role. It's also about setting the table to make sure you're trauma informed, to make sure that these employers realize that we might need some building up of hard and soft skills. You know, we need to set the table so that we don't perpetuate harm. Is that our fault? No, unfortunately, this is what our lived experiences consist of. But we can do the job. We can if you give us a chance. And if you work with us in building up these hard skills and soft skills, according to whatever job it is, it's not saying we can't do the job. We just need a little bit more work. You know, and as you guys know, because of the last presentation, I am coming at you from school and I have class in approximately 9 minutes. So I want to thank you for this time. I'm going to drop my email in the chat. The New York City Justice Peer Initiative is building a workforce out of directly impacted folks. I'm building a curriculum. I am a peer duly certified. I'm building a workforce of directly impacted folks. I invite you to get in touch with me. Let's push the envelope forward. Let's remove barriers for directly impacted folks. And let's get out there and do this work. Thank you for having me. And I'm going to turn it back to Kathy.
Thank you, Skip, and thanks for sharing. And for folks to really be thinking about, you know, how does this apply to you, to your work, to your role? That every single person that we encounter as service participants, as staff, as folks who are doing the work, whether it's clinical roles, peer support roles, whether it's other kinds of direct service, we all need to be working in spaces that are trauma informed, in that we're looking for what are the things that either help us, support us, or harm us, and then work to change the things that are harming. So thank you so much, Skip. Oops. So I want us to think for a minute about our organization. Think about your program. Every program has an organizational culture and an organizational climate. Organizational culture is the way we do things. It's our policies, it's our onboarding, it's how do we welcome people in? How do we supervise folks? How do we get the bills paid so that we keep the doors open? It's all of the things that we do. Organizational climate is what does it feel like to work here? And when we are working towards trauma-informed spaces, we have to look at the culture, which again is how are we doing things? How do we have policies that define what it means to treat people with dignity and respect? What does it say about equity? What does it say about our supervision processes? What does it say about our time off and attendance issues? Like, what does that look like in real time? Organizational climate is, do I feel welcome? Are we collaborative? Do we share? Do we engage? And we have all these intentions for our work, especially if you work as an advocate or as a peer specialist, or there's some role that you're involved in that is supporting other human beings. We don't want to judge folks. We want to make sure that we are culturally connected to the communities we are in. We want to make sure we're behaving in ethical ways and that we're balancing the formal authority that we have. For those of you who are in leadership roles, you do have formal authority. We might be uncomfortable with that, but we do have responsibilities that are different. And so we have to step towards those things and look at how are we using power? How do we really work in survivor-defined ways? That means that I'm not doing anything to you ever. I'm only going to do stuff with you that you are interested in doing. And so when we look at our services, we have all these intentions. When we hire staff, we have all these intentions. And then often what people experience is something very different. Part of the reason we experience things differently is because in our work, if you're working with human beings, all of these things are impacting your workplace and all the staff that are in it. Many of us are called to human services work because of our own growing up, our own personal experiences, our own responses to trauma. We have historical and collective trauma, as we've talked about in our last webinar. Like, it's not just this individual look at what's the one thing that happened to you. We know each and every one of us that has been impacted by trauma are often impacted by multiple experiences with trauma. So those histories of genocide, of enslavement, those histories of being unwelcome, those histories of why folks are immigrants and what they experience once they arrive. And is that welcoming or not welcoming? Right? And so we know that these things are in the mix. And then in our day-to-day stuff, based on our identities, we may experience microaggressions. We may experience outright racial aggression that has no subtlety to it at all. And there's lots and lots of things that are inequitable. And so we don't all need the same thing, but we all need what we need to feel welcome, to feel included, to be a part of. And then there are experiences with secondary trauma. Secondary trauma are the things that impact us because we are present and we are connected and collaborating and believing in others. And so secondary just means it's not your direct experience, but these things have happened to someone. We're present, we're supportive, it impacts us. And that's expected. It's to be expected. And there are things that we can do to build up our reserves, to make sure we have support to navigate. Then we have times in our organizations and our programs where we have enough staff and enough resources to do all the things we want to do and that we're charged to do. And then we have times when we don't, and our organizations don't have the capacity to do the things that we intend. Our roles get murky and unclear, and all of these things contribute to stress and burnout. And what we also know is that when trauma is present, and especially when there's trauma that impacts our whole organization, it can be really difficult to tell the difference between what's one person's distress and what's something that's happening to all of us that is traumatizing all of us in our programs. And so lots for us to think about in terms of what impacts how we show up and how we interact with each other. When we take the time to consider the impact of structural oppression as part of the discrimination and stigma that folks experience while we do this work, it's challenging, it's hard. It's why we had that invitation to Brave Space. I don't know anyone who loves talking about racism or sexism or ageism or how people are discriminated against because we have different disabilities and abilities and capacities. And then how we identify in terms of sexual orientation and gender presentation, and how we think about who's new to our communities and are we inclusive and welcoming, right? No one loves talking about this stuff, but many of us are called to talk about it because the harms continue to be perpetuated. And so we've got to look at our workspaces and ask the questions, even though we intend to behave in these ways, what's really happening? What are people actually experiencing? And can we be fearless in our look at that? When we are afraid to look, when we are worried about, what will people think of us? What if we just ignore this really big elephant in the room? Because sometimes that feels easier. It isn't easier on the folks who are impacted. And so whether or not we enjoy these conversations, I'm always going to show up for them. And we have a commitment for those of us who are involved in this conversation today to keep engaging in this conversation until there are no more harms. And so this is an invitation for all of you who are here today to really think about, what does my organization look like? What is my program doing with these conversations? How do we make sure that our workplace is welcoming and inclusive and that people feel like they have not just a chance to be here, but a chance to thrive here? And that would be everyone has a chance to thrive here. There's a resource that we're sharing today, and it's called The White Supremacy Culture in Organizations. It's a guide, and it was put together by the folks who created the Dismantling Racism conversation, and then some additional groups who looked at this work over time, and then put this guide together just in the last few years to update this conversation. So when we talk about the impact of white supremacy culture in organizations, it's from this legacy of trauma, from this legacy of colonization. It's from a legacy of people who have power, using that power to do all kinds of things, including create organizations. And so this is an opportunity to really kind of lean into, and again, this may be uncomfortable, but to lean into, what are we really talking about here? And so sometimes when folks hear, white supremacy culture, there's a lot of, alarm bells that ring of, can we really talk about racism? Can we really talk about white supremacy? Are you calling me a racist? Like, people get worried about all those things. So I want to take a moment and unpack what we're really talking about. When in our organizations, we are focused on everything has to be perfect, we've always got to get it right, and we get so worried about that we only hire some people for some jobs because we're worried they won't be perfect. So we don't give people a chance, or we're so focused on deficits and negativity that we don't celebrate and honor people's strengths. That we are so concerned about writing everything down. And you all have heard this, right? If you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. If it's not documented, it doesn't exist. There's all kinds of human connection that is happening and doesn't get documented with words. So are there other ways that we can talk about our work? We are visual people. We are sound-centered people. There's all kinds of ways we can show up. When we believe there's only one right way to do something, and we lean into that so hard that we are closed to all other ideas. So we start telling folks, this is what we're going to do. There's no inclusion. There's no invitation. There's no welcoming. It's, here it is. Either take it or you leave it, but that's it. When all the power for decision-making and conversation sits with one person or with two people, and we don't ask others for their input, for their thoughts, for their experience, and we hoard that power, we hold on to it with everything that we've got. That's what we're talking about in this legacy. So there's this sense of paternalism is that things are very male dominated, and that's where the seat of decision-making, seat of power, and again, there's no room for anybody else. And when there's a challenge, we defend. Instead of saying, oh yeah, let me think about that. What we say is, oh no, not me, I'm not doing that. And so we can have these barriers and boundaries that are up so high and so wide and so firm that those on one side of that boundary are so comfortable that they feel they have a right to that comfort and really don't want to hear from folks who are disruptive and troublemaking because they're saying, wait a minute, there might be a different way to do this. What if we just name the challenge and figure out how we don't participate in that? How we change what we do, how we stop looking at just what's one individual's way, and we look at what can we do collectively, collaboratively, how do we work together? I've worked with some organizations where people in leadership positions are so afraid of being challenged, are so afraid of conflict, that they shut down every conversation. And so what happens is that you get less creativity, you get less energy, you get less excitement, you get less investment, and you get high turnover because people don't feel like this is for me. And so as we look at some of these legacies, what does progress mean? How we're focused on quantity and how much of something we can do. And that maybe there's one person who decides a sense of urgency. I was working with a group and there was a person, one of the staff, who was really feeling targeted by the racism that was showing up at work and really struggling and tried to have all kinds of conversations. And conversations kept getting shut down. And one of the things that she said was, I'm hoping and I'm waiting for people to learn, for leadership to do more reading, for people to read more articles, to do more study, to be able to understand what I'm talking about. But in the meantime, I'm dying. And I thought, it was so powerful, but also it came from such a place of feeling, just repeated harms. And how much do folks have to endure before we can say, I see and I understand, or I don't fully understand, but I'm ready to listen and I hear what you're saying. And so we have to look at ways that we can do this differently. I want to talk a little bit about power and privilege, and that privilege is like the easy pass. You didn't earn it, you have it. It's yours because of how you identify and how you show up. And so we have to begin to look at, in our programs, who has privilege and who has power and how do they use it. And usually it's concentrated in one or more small places. And it's usually with leadership. We often work in hierarchical organizations, and then we try to talk about collaboration. And so there's a fundamental conflict in that. And so it makes it clear that when we work in programs that are structured this way, we have to take extra steps to be inclusive. We have to ask, who's part of this conversation and who's not? Who's making decisions? What are the messages? What are the ways that people find out what is happening? And how are people being judged? Because there's a whole lot of judgment about who's worthy, who's allowed, who's capable of participating. And that all of these questions can just really be harmful when folks are judged to not be worthy, not be capable, and are considered to be part of the problem. And so again, when we have folks who are working in trauma-informed places or places that say we are trauma-informed, we have to really take a look at, is that what everyone experiences? Do people really feel that welcoming? Do people really feel that inclusion? And what are the ways that we other folks, and how do we stop doing that? And can we have real and meaningful conversation about what that looks like? Yeah, we're just wanting to welcome you to share some wisdom with us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So, as you can see by the title of the slide, I'm going to discuss some everyday acts of oppression, really from a lens of lived experience. And although today we're talking about, we're getting more deep into trauma in the workplace, I felt compelled to share this lived experience story or example to just really talk about the continuum of trauma across one's lifespan, and using myself as an example in full transparency and honesty. So I would like to talk about how my trauma really began in the private healthcare system. And when I say private healthcare system, I mean when I was much younger and on my parents' insurance, and they were both gainfully employed, thankfully, as opposed to being in the public health system, which is more Medicaid managed care. So that's really the distinguishing point there. My trauma began in this healthcare system in particular for whatever reason, but it started with a misdiagnosis of mental health issues, poor treatment, and a lack of provider cultural competency. So you'll see, and just in those three items, the act of oppression, though I believe it was unintentional, on the provider's point or part, it still was a bit oppressive for me personally. So the system that was set up, and also speaking to oppression, really the healthcare system that was set up to help me and to help others can at times be oppressive in its delivery is really the main point I want to get across. So that's where the oppression comes in. When one goes through that, or when I went through that, it was difficult to build and sustain some sense of self-esteem and self-worth, which will then translate into the workplace as I went through and cycled through several jobs, might even want to call them dead end, but were they really dead end, or was I just really not ready to receive those opportunities? So I'll go on to say that I was not really set up to succeed, both in the healthcare system and in these workplaces, which were a bit toxic as well. So we're dealing with kind of two, how do I want to say this? Kind of two enemies simultaneously. Next, this contributed to chronic cycles or a chronic cycle of unemployment and underemployment for me. Either I was unemployed and either getting help or benefits, or underemployed where I'm in a job space where I'm not really utilizing my skill sets and education and things of that nature. So today, how this translates is that I still, and this is still a work in progress for me, so I welcome everyone's, comments and questions. I still struggle to feel deserving of a healthier and more inclusive workplace. And that's in full honesty and transparency. It's getting better though. And as I'm actually learning so much from this trauma series about, where my trauma is and how to combat it. So I want to talk about some solutions and not just be so doom and gloom with the trauma and the oppression. When things really started to turn the corner for me was a combination of peer support, which we all provide on this call, and a combination of peer support and psychosocial programming. In both these instances, I was able to become more self-aware and more aware of my inner resilience, really. And it allowed me to, as my mom has taught me from her spiritual practice, to turn poison into medicine, for lack of a better way of saying that. So I just wanted to share that story because I think it really displays the power of peer support and how it can really help someone turn the corner. As you know, I'm at the Department of Health now, and I'm really experiencing positive things. And I'm in that healthier and more inclusive workplace, thankfully. But it was definitely years in the making and did not happen overnight. So I would love to hear your stories too. I'm open to hearing other experiences. Really, this community and this platform that we're on today helps me to feel like I'm not alone. And one of my goals is to actively listen to the workforce, such as you all, and to produce programming that really serves you. So in conclusion, what I'm now realizing is that I needed external structures, in my case, to support and cultivate my internal values. And that's what I got from peer support and from the psychosocial programs and a number of other treatment modalities and frameworks. The more I self-actualized, the more I was able to recover. And I believe this is the gift we offer as peer support workers. We help people self-actualize and ultimately live full and productive lives. So that's really my share today. And yes, I saw in the chat, this was SGI USA, Soka Gakkai International. That is correct, Dylan, I believe is the name. So yes, that was where I got the term poison into medicine analogy. So thank you for letting me share, and I'm open to feedback. Thank you.
Patrice, thank you so much. And I think the thing for us to keep in mind that was so evident in your sharing is that one person can have many different kinds of traumatic impacts. And we've talked a little bit about that. But for us to really think about then, given we're human beings and we're doing the work, we have our own stories, our own experiences. I too am a trauma survivor and have talked about this for decades, is how do we really think about creating programs where those of us who are doing the work feel included, feel a part of, and can keep doing the work of our own healing as we support other people in their healing journeys. And so really important for us to pay attention to that in our programs, we don't always show up in the way that we intend, meaning that our programs don't always. That sometimes staff experience where we feel valued and included and welcome and we feel secure in our employment. And other times it can feel unsafe. People can feel as if they don't have much to offer that is useful to others and can feel excluded or outcast as part of a group. So important for us, again, to take this fearless look at how are we doing in our program? What does our organizational climate feel like? What does it look like for us to do this work? And when people are feeling in this state of uncertainty and confusion and chaos, trauma reminders are ever present. So we talked a little bit about trauma reminders in our last webinar, but really wanting to make sure that we name that this happens for those of us as we work. So staff are experiencing things that bring about a trauma response as if it were our original trauma. Everything from conflict in relationships and working in places that feel toxic to that exclusion and loneliness. But keep in mind that a trauma reminder is something that was previously neutral. And that now, because of the experiences that I've had and that othering I felt as part of my work, even going to work is a trauma reminder. Trying to do paperwork might be a trauma reminder. The smell that one of my colleagues has of the cologne that they're wearing could be a trauma reminder. Feeling that I have no power, no choice, disconnected, no involvement, all of these things can bring about that same feeling as the initial traumatic experience. So when we talk about structural oppression and our work, it means that in our organizations, we have big work to do. So I want to talk about also that, when you have several folks who are experiencing trauma in their workplace, and then you have other folks who are witnessing what they're experiencing, or there's an event that happened to all of us that we're not talking about, we're not unpacking. Even though that happens in a community, I'm part of a work community, that it's very easy for others to make it Kathy's problem or Patrice's problem. And so we focus on one staff person and their behavior. Are they exhausted from the work? Are they burned out? Well, burnout is when an individual or group of individuals really has maxed on the structure, the funding, the way we do the work. So burnout is telling you that there's something wrong in our organization. Our program is experiencing something and we need to get to the bottom of it. And rather than focusing on just one person, we need to ask the question, what's going on here that is impacting all of us or many of us, and be fearless in that look. And if you're in a leadership role, sometimes what leaders tend to do is to focus solely on an individual staff person. So that one person doesn't have the skills they need to navigate this next thing, or they keep making the same mistake over and over and over. Well, what is it that we're doing collaboratively, collectively, so that folks feel a part of this bigger picture? Folks feel a part of a group or a team, that we're not blaming folks, because when people are struggling, they often blame themselves and they often feel as if they can't be successful. And, I keep thinking about what Skip was saying earlier about how we set the table. When we set the table for success of everyone, we ask the hard questions. Who's not included? Who's not feeling successful? I wonder what I'm missing as a leader in terms of support or impacts of microaggressions, of structural racism, of ableism. Am I focused solely on the person who makes the least amount of money, who is the most marginalized? Or am I looking at my entire team in terms of what does each person need from me at this point in time? Often, individuals experience and express signs of organizational trauma and people are struggling and suffering, and that no one looks at the structure. No one looks at the processes or events that create the challenge in the first place. And so things can stay invisible and go unexplored. And often it's because we see if there's one or two people that are complaining, they often get treated as they're the squeaky wheel. That there's something that they are complaining about, that they're not giving us a fair chance. They're not participating in ways that are helpful. I have talked to, I would say in the last 2 weeks, at least 4 or 5 different people who said, I'm experiencing this thing in my organization where I'm trying to bring attention to some of the processes or policies that are harmful and trying to get us to work together and look better at it. And I keep getting called the troublemaker or the squeaky wheel, or one person even said, I was asked by my supervisor to stop talking. And so these are harms that just keep rippling out and harming more people and more people. And whether or not we want to look at it and name it, the impacts are there and people are suffering. So better for us to move beyond that fear. I have a card deck that I use, and I love these. And these are called the Book of Awakening. And there's full cards, and they all say different things. And I usually in the morning, I'll randomly pull one. And the one that I randomly pulled today says, be brave. And it talks about how fearful we can be about looking at the things that worry us or scare us. And that when we can get beyond that fear, especially knowing that we don't have to get beyond those fears alone, and say, you know what, let's talk about this. Let's have real talk. Let's have a hard conversation. And let's stay in it until we figure out a direction where we can move forward together. That takes bravery. That takes showing up. It takes commitment. It takes knowing that it will not be easy, but I'm also in this with others. And that's the kind of work that our programs are called upon to do. When we choose not to, when we, avoid the challenges, and that these kinds of experience just exist and they simmer and fester, what we end up with is a less effective organization. We're not good at what we do when people are struggling and suffering as they're trying to do the work. People stop feeling effective as our organization. We stop being effective. There's a reduced sense of respect and empathy and dignity for the people that we serve and support and for our colleagues. So we start to view each other as suspicious. And that people can identify strongly with other staff, but also that can get to be a challenge where folks can't separate their own distress from other people's. And so boundaries get very mushy for some, but they also can get very high, wide, and broad for others. And so what the big impact of all of this is that we stop connecting. What we know about trauma and what heals trauma is connection. Connection is the antidote. There's not magic. Connection is the antidote to trauma. So there's all kinds of other things we do to strengthen that connection, add to that connection, build on that connection. But without it, healing is very difficult. So whether we're connecting to resources, connecting to other human beings, connecting to all of that at once, connection is key. And when folks are struggling under the weight of oppression, connection is very difficult to seek, and it's very difficult to sustain. And so again, really needing to look at how did we get here and how do we unpack it? And then what can we do differently about it? So I just want to pause a minute and see if there's any questions or thoughts or comments. I would invite anyone who would like to share a comment or a thought, please do.
There's just a lot of wonderful thankings here in the chat. Folks are really connecting what being said. There's a few statements here about turning poison into medicine, turning negative into a positive. The lotus flower blooms in mud. The murky mud provides nutrients. Someone said. So growing up under capitalism has made it hard to shed the skin of power and control, someone said. Someone was really thankful to you, Patrice, for sharing your journey. Said it was wonderful and they needed to hear that for sure. Someone also added, I get irritated when my peer experience becomes a measurement against my fellow peer coworkers. My peer experience include working as a full-time supply NCO in the military. Most of my fellow peers did not come from that kind of work background. I agree that there needs to be something available as a means to determine how to support development for all kinds of peers. They want to show up and be capable of performing exceptional service that deserves to be nurtured and empowered. It's important to meet people where they are at, not just for recipients of service, but for staff, all staff. I want to thank you all for those addings.
Beautiful, beautiful stuff. Thank you so much. One of the things that really resonated for me and what you were just sharing was around that, my experience being used to measure the capabilities of other folks. And, there's a lot of that. And again, the roots are in oppression. So when someone says to me, Kathy, we want you to come because you're so articulate. There's a group of 100 folks who have all different kinds of experiences. And yet this articulate, which so often is said and meant as a compliment, really is undermining. It's, we all have something to contribute, and it's how do we make the spaces? And so that's another one of those legacies. And for the person who shared about capitalism and power, we really need to be able to have these hard conversations and look at the impacts and the legacies of that. We place so much value on behaviors that can continue to be harmful to folks and used to other people and exclude people from being successful and thriving and doing this work.
I'd like to add, a question came here. How do you manage up when dealing with ineffective trauma-informed supervision?
I love that question. One of my favorite things to talk about is trauma-informed supervision. And so what I will say, one, is that, in our time that we have today, we can't fully explore that. But what I will say is that sharing resources. So you have the slides and the materials from our first webinar, the slides and materials from this webinar. Share those things broadly. Whenever I work in an organization, particularly as a supervisor or leader, one of the things I always do is I ask any staff person who goes to training, who attends a training of any kind, come back, share the materials, and during a staff meeting, share what you took away from that experience. We need to create space for collaborative learning, and that's one of the ways that we can do it. Effective supervision looks like something, and so many leaders are afraid of saying out loud that they're really struggling. And one of the things we have to encourage is every leader to say and to recognize, I struggle, and that we can bring resources and supports for that purpose. One of the things that our national center does across the country is for domestic violence and sexual assault programs, we provide technical assistance and training. But we also provide technical assistance and training for any portion of the mental health system. And we talk about it in the framework of domestic and sexual violence. And so it's making sure that folks know that the resources are here, that you can say from whatever position you're in, I came across some resources. The other thing I would mention is that in our last session, Tina Brooks shared some resources that are incredibly helpful. One of them I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a minute, but there was a couple of pages of resources around trauma-informed workplaces, just really encouraging folks to share, and that sometimes we do have to manage up. Our leaders may have blind spots, they may be unknowing, they may be unaware, and it's really important for us to be able to say, I wanted to share this because this had an impact on me, or I wanted to share this because what's happening here is impacting me. And we need pathways for those really brave conversations. Anything else from the chat or any other thoughts or comments?
Well, it was good that you mentioned being able to share those resources, because that was one of the next questions. Is there any resources that can be shared on trauma responsive supervision? Someone offered, with a heck of a lot of grace and empathy, they were adding to your comment, they didn't become those kind of supervisors overnight. Someone showed them that to behave like that was acceptable as a person in power. Said, I coax a conversation as opposed to confrontation and offense.
Yeah. I like to call it calling each other in. So, we do a lot of calling out problematic behavior, and there's a lot of, finger pointing and shaming. When we call each other in, it's with grace, and it's with courage, and it's with kindness. And what we're saying is our program can be better, and we can be better if we think about and talk about these things. And here's some resources that I want to share that will help us get started in that direction, and then committing to it and staying with it for sure. So it's calling each other in. And absolutely, I think being an effective supervisor takes a lot. It takes knowledge, but it also takes willingness and commitment. It takes courage. It takes being able to say, I don't know, but I'm willing to learn. It takes recognizing our own vulnerabilities and being able to say that as a supervisor, I may be good at these things, but on some other things over here, I'm still learning. I'm still growing. And there are opportunities to make that shift. And again, I would just encourage folks to keep pursuing that conversation, because I think it is very difficult to have lasting change in our organizations if we don't believe that change is possible, or if we don't feel that we can be that vulnerable. There are all kinds of barriers to change. There is one resource I do want to tell you about, and it's called The Guide for Implementing Accessible, Culturally Responsive, and Trauma-Informed Workplaces. It's a product that we produced at our center, and this guide number 2 is called Supporting Change Leadership. And so if you really want to look at opportunities for reflection, how can I make change? How can I do something different? That guide is specifically focused on change leadership. One of the resources I'm going to share in a few minutes is our first guide, and it's really about looking at our programs, looking at our organizations, looking at our culture, looking at what it feels like, and really naming and unpacking organizational trauma.
I just wanted to add one more thing here, which really co-signs what you're saying. Someone offered being brave is so important, takes courage, and you can't be brave without being afraid. So
That's right.
Let's go.
Let's go. I love it. Thank you all so much for all of that. So in our programs, what we're trying to figure out is, how do we counter a legacy of lifetime trauma? The way we do it is through the quality of our supervisory relationships. So we have to be able to demonstrate and balance all of these pieces, where we're not just talking about, you have choices, but they're real choices, they're meaningful choices. and that we have collaborative conversations as part of supervision that support staff to explore and learn, but also support leaders to explore and learn. That people experience respect in the way that they are welcomed at work, included at work, and supported at work. And that respect is at the top of the list. It's not just the folks that we are engaged with in peer support that we're talking about dignity and respect. It's dignity and respect for everyone. That there's a cultural resonance. And what that means is that we recognize that we are unique cultural beings. And that if you're telling me that you have this experience with oppression, I need to understand it. Not challenge it, not counter it, but understand it. And then look at the ways those harms are perpetuated in my supervision and to stop doing those things. That we have a shared responsibility and a shared accountability for how we work together and collaborate. And that empathy and listening, being trustworthy, all these pieces are at the core of what we do and how we do it. And we need to recognize that we have very complicated feelings about power at work. And so I've worked in organizations where leaders were so uncomfortable with their own formal authority and power that they were just very hands off. And whatever happened, happened until there was something that threatened to make the newspaper, or until there was something that was harmful to someone who was participating in our services. And then we'd be like, oh no, this can't happen. And then the leader would swoop in and try to fix it. And then they would back way out and swoop out again. That kind of supervision is traumatizing. It is not supportive. It is undermining and doesn't facilitate a climate where we can learn and grow together. So how do we really name the power that we have, and the formal authority that we have? I can't tell you we are only going to collaborate and every decision will be made by consensus and then say, oh no, you're going to go do this. That's not consensus. And if we don't have time for consensus, because it does take time, I'm not going to put that on the table for how we're working. I'm going to say, I need to make a decision, and I would really like everyone's input before I do. Better to be transparent than perfect. And I'm wondering if folks had any thoughts about use of power at work and how that shows up. I'll just press pause there for a moment to see if this is something folks are wanting to share about. And while folks are thinking, I'll share an example. Early on in my career, I was running a housing program, and one of the staff came to me one day and said, I want to give you some feedback, and I don't know how you're going to take it, but I really need to say this. And I was like, sure, please. And what she said is that whenever you share, we're having a staff meeting, we're sharing information, it's usually really comfortable. There's a lot of give and take. But when you have made a decision about something that you don't want people to question, that you actually say whatever it is you're going to say, and then at the end of your sentence, you say, period, dot. I had no idea that what I was effectively doing was shutting down all discussion, all opportunities for challenge. My way was the only way. All of the things that we're saying as an oppressive way to be, I was behaving in that way and not even recognizing it. And by shutting down all challenge, all conversation, I was effectively saying, it's my way or the highway, and I don't want to hear anything more about it. And so we have to be able to give each other that feedback and not rest so much in our power in our comfort that we shut out and shut down conversation, because that undermines folks. It undermines staff. It undermines our capacities to be effective in what we do. Any other thoughts or comments from anybody?
So, Kathy, we have a question. How do we shift to share power from hierarchy?
Good. It's an excellent question, a really, really excellent question. And it takes all of the things that we're talking about today and more. It takes, first of all, naming that there is formal authority and power that you have. So if I'm the director of a program, I can't tell the staff that I work with, we're going to share power and then continue to make all the decisions. I have to actively look at what are the things that are reinforcing this power dynamic, and how am I choosing to use the power that I have? And so again, bigger conversation than what we have time for today, but everything that we're talking about today is relevant to that conversation.
Thank you. Another one says, I think people underestimate the power of honest service instead of attempts to belittle people.
Yeah.
Another one is making decisions to change operational protocol without exploring the impact to frontline staff or individuals receiving service.
Yes.
Last one, why then can't a leader share delegation without staff feeling left out or have to follow decision-making without voicing concerns? Is this still an issue?
It's an issue every day. It's an issue every single day. There are folks who are working that don't feel heard. There are folks who are working who don't feel respected. I mean, these are the calls, and the questions and conversations that I get asked every single week, that folks are feeling very much oppressed in the work that they do. And so we have to look at, why is that dynamic so pervasive? And so if we're willing to ask the hard questions and have these kinds of conversations that we're having today, that's a beginning. It takes a lot of intentional work to unpack structural racism and other forms of structural oppression. It takes a lot of consistent commitment over time.
Just want to give one more piece.
Sure.
It says positive power in the workplace comes through vulnerability from management.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. And again, the guide I was mentioning on change leadership really speaks to that. It has reflection questions for leaders around vulnerability and asking for help, and how do we share space. I wanted to share this example because I think it speaks to so much of the comments that you all are raising. This is from a document from Resilient Wisconsin, and this is just one page of it. The entire resource is available for all of you, but I wanted to hone in on this one section of looking at cultural, historical, and gender issues as part of what it means to be trauma-informed in the workplace. That leaders model and support behaviors that move past cultural stereotypes and biases. So it's really unpacking all the way that bias shows up, naming it, pointing it out, whether it's related to age or religion or gender, geography, ethnicity, and race, and saying, oh, wait, that was a stereotype, and I just painted you with that brush, right? And so we need to be able to have these conversations, that leaders are aware of their own implicit biases and privilege. So when we wonder, what are the things we can do? There are tons of roadmaps for this is how we can begin. That leaders ensure access to gender responsive services and supports, again, not just for the people we serve, but for staff as well. Is there an employee assistance program? How do we support everyone, not just the folks identified as peers? How do we support everyone in the workplace? that there's policies, practices, and protocols that really look at how responsive are we being to issues of systemic oppression. And that when there is historical or racialized trauma among staff, that is addressed. And then for staff to be able to model all of those same things in all of their interactions with the people we support. And so it's really taking a look at, again, can we be fearless in the ways that we show up and support each other? So again, the complete resource is available to you. It is our responsibility to intentionally shape our organizational culture and our climate. So again, perfectionism is one of those legacies of structural oppression. So we have to look at, how do we not continue to do that? How do we open up spaces for vulnerability, but also spaces for learning and growing together? What's our commitment? What are the kinds of policies and practices we want to put in place? That's the how do we do things, organizational culture. And how do we want it to feel for all of us? That's the organizational climate. One of the very easy first step is to have conversations about, what does wellness look like? If we focus on well-being for everyone who's part of our program, connected in any way, what does that look like? Is a great beginning conversation. How do we think about both physical safety and emotional safety as part of our well-being, and what's necessary for us to show up in good ways to do good work? Really concrete, easy conversation, good place to begin. And so much will come out of this in terms of ideas that can then be acted on. So I wanted to share some additional resources, but I wanted to check and see if there were any other questions or comments.
Someone offered a link that they wanted to mention about an individual. I guess his name was Julian Sarafin, who was a Harvard Law School graduate. He was employed at a company making six-figure salary. After that, after his mental health diagnoses, as talked about in these other places, I guess, and representative, the multimedia content manager, he attributes his mental health deterioration to workplace trauma and power imbalance. The person encourage everyone who's interested to look at the link. There's a LinkedIn in the chat that you could find and locate and view that.
Love that. Thank you so much for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and the thing is like, so often leaders will think like these kinds of things are only happening where I work, or they can't happen where I work. And the thing is, it's so pervasive. It's happening everywhere. It's why there's all these resources and why we're having these conversations. So the first resource I wanted to mention is the guide that I pulled from and shared, all of the legacies of white supremacy culture. Again, the entire guide is available to you as a resource. And really thinking about, again, not so much how do we target one individual or one person and say, you know, you were terrible, but how do we look at this ongoing legacy of a culture of supremacy on human services, on not-for-profits, on how we show up at the work, how do we do the work, how we struggle while we do the work. So really helpful resource, really amazing guide to have some really challenging conversations, really useful. I also wanted to share this resource that Skip actually found and is shared with us, Trauma and Resilience at Work. And so another really useful guide really looks at ways that trauma shows up, ways that trauma impacts us in the workplace, and things we can do, actions we can take. So we've, scratched the surface here today. And there are lots of guides and resources that you can use to continue the conversation or to bring this conversation back to your workplace. One of the pieces that I liked, and again, this was from, this piece of thinking about parallel values and trauma-informed practices, that in any way or time that we're doing this work and thinking about trauma-informed, we have an obligation and a responsibility and accountability to not just make our programs inviting, comfortable, welcoming for service participants, but how do we make sure that staff feel supported and strengthened and cared for as they do the very hard work of what we do? This is a resource that I mentioned earlier from our National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. So this is Guide 1, where we talked about, let's look at socially what's happening. Let's look at how we're connecting. Let's look at emotional environments, which means how are people feeling? What's the climate like here? And then how are we in relationship with one another? What's the relationships among colleagues? What are the relationships amongst people that we're serving and supporting? What are the relationships between those in leadership roles and those who are doing the direct service? Let's make sure that all of that is open and welcoming and trauma-informed. And to be able to have these conversations, we have to be willing to look at, again, what are the sources of trauma in our organizations? What's impacting us? So we have to look at what hurts and then unpack it and be effective in what we do to support healing. I wanted to share this quote, as an ending for us, to really think about that if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let us work together. And to see if there are any reflections or questions or comments in our last few minutes together. When you get the slides, you'll have some links for some additional resources, and you'll have contact information for all of our presenters today, for Tina Brooks and the New York State Trauma Informed Network, and for Laverne Miller, who helped make contributions to our webinar series. And I wanted to let this quote sit with us for a bit and see if there are any other thoughts or comments from the group.
So in addition to co-signing you, someone said being trauma-informed includes everyone, and every ability and sanism and ableism are huge.
Yes.
You can't really be a trauma-informed service organization unless you're also a trauma-informed workplace.
That's right. That is right. It starts at home.
Mm-hmm. Someone says the burnout, bad supervision, etc. all affects the clients too. People with trauma are very, very observant.
That's right. I always say as a survivor, we are watching and taking careful notes. Any other thoughts or comments from our group today? There's available resources, and here's our contact information for everyone. Rita, I'd like to welcome you to close us out.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Another incredibly wonderful, deep, rich, heartful conversation that's so important for us to be looking at in all of our spaces and places. So I just want to say on behalf of Carlton Whitmore and Patrice and the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, Department of Consumer Affairs, and Patrice particularly with the peer and community health worker Workforce Consortium, and that's a mouthful, and the Academy of Peer Services. We thank you very much for attending today's webinar. And we especially want to thank Kathy. She is with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, as well as Inspire Training and Consulting. And we also want to, even though she's not here, but she certainly will hear this later, we want to thank Skip, Helen Skipper with the New York City Justice Peer Initiative. Next time around, we'll have Tina Brooks, who is also with the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, Department of Consumer Affairs. And she'll be talking a little bit more in depth about the New York State Trauma Informed Network, the resources that are available there. But we plan on having a much richer, in-depth conversation, so please do come back and join us then. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks,
And Kathy,
everyone.
and Kathy,